Thank you for joining. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining the session. My name is Jim Rabeau. I am a professor in physics and a deputy director at the Sydney Nano Institute, and I'll be hosting the session today. Today, we're fortunate to be talking to Professor Tony Weiss, who I'll introduce in a moment. In terms of format, I'll start by having a conversation with Tony about his commercialization journey, and we'll open up to questions that you can type into the chat box a little later on. And my colleague Omid Kavahe has offered to select some of those questions and ask these on your behalf. It'll just make things a little bit simpler and streamlined. Just to point out as well that the session is being recorded. Okay, let me introduce Professor Weiss. Professor Weiss is the McCoy Chair in Biochemistry, Professor of Biochemistry and Molecular Biotechnology, NHMRC Leadership Fellow, and leads Tissue Engineering and Regenerative Medicine at the Charles Perkins Center at the University of Sydney. Tony founded Elastagen Pty Ltd, which we're going to hear about today in more detail, in 2005 to commercialize a breakthrough technology to manufacture a form of synthetic skin called tropoelastin. In 2018, Elastagen announced that it was to be acquired by Allergan PLC, which is one of the 20 largest biopharmaceutical companies in the world. The $350 million deal is one of the largest transactions ever completed in the Australian life sciences sector. Tony has won numerous awards, including recently the Eureka Prize for Innovation in Medical Research, and is president-elect of the Tissue Engineering and Regenerative Medicine International Society, and deeply involved in many, many other societies and community groups. So welcome, Tony, to our Sydney Nano Commercialization Fireside Chat. Maybe you can just say a few words and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim, and thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here, even in a virtual sense. In terms of today's discussion, what I'm really hoping is that I can get a chance to share with you that it is possible to have a dual existence as an academic and also to commercialize technology. I'm hoping to also share with you some of the excitement involved in that kind of journey. And maybe you can learn a few lessons from the process as well. I hope that is a possibility here today. My hope is that this will be a bit of fun for you, but also learning experience. And by all means, if there turn out to be the occasional questions you'd like to ask even after the event, then I'm very happy through Jim to be able to provide the appropriate responses to you as well. So again, it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to today's chat. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Tony, I just want to say as well, I mean, we're grateful for your time. It's a rare opportunity to have this kind of resource to tap into and to share your story with the community.
Thank you.
So, as discussed, the format will be, I have a series of questions which are going to guide, but ultimately Tony and I are going to sort of just have a chat. I think there'll be opportunity to answer some of your burning questions in the audience, and I'm certain that there'll be some inspiration that will flow through as well. So let me kick off here. I had a slightly different version that I shared with you yesterday, Tony, so I'm going to start off with something a little bit different. In the climate we're in right now, where research impact is such an important thing, back in 2005, I don't think that language was being discussed. At what point did you become aware in this development journey? At what point did you become aware that there was a need or an interest in your technology outside of the lab?
Yeah, thank you. So there were a few steps in this process. So one of them is I always believed that there was value outside even before people told me there was. I always believed that the technology that we had was able to, I guess, putting it bluntly and maybe poetically, to make a better world. While I enjoyed doing the research in the lab, that early belief helped to drive much of the expectation that others would, I guess, fundamentally catch up. we had a lot of early interactions with outstanding people. Prior to forming Elastagen, I had the joy of working with Johnson & Johnson Proprietary Limited through the University of Sydney. We had a series of agreements through what was the antecedent of CDIP. And in addition to that, I began to learn a lot about not only their interest and why they were interested in the technology, but also how one does business in this kind of area. And so I guess I cut my baby teeth on that process with the people at Johnson & Johnson. And it was only after that, then of course, we formed the company.
Okay, no, that's it. And it is such an important part of any discussions we currently are having around commercialization and even research for that matter, trying to understand what is what the external need or value might be. So in terms of technology then, often it is in development for a long time before that you get an opportunity to commercialize. What was the situation with Elastagen, and how long did it take you to turn your research into something that was fundable and funded by a commercial, like a venture capital company or whatever?
Yeah, thanks. So there was a sequence of steps, and again, I'm hoping this is relevant to people in their own personal circumstance today. We transitioned from a model where we had plans to license the technology from a lab. I'm sure a lot of people have thought, well, do I license the technology, or do I, through CDIP or whatever, and expect royalty flow at some point, leave it for the big professionals to run with it, or do I start up a company type of thing, or variations on that kind of theme? And both sound a bit scary to people, but I'm hoping through today you'll see that it's not scary. It's exhilarating. It's a bit like a roller coaster ride, but it's not anything other than that. When Johnson & Johnson restructured, and Johnson & Johnson Research Proprietary Limited in Australia ceased its local R&D investment arm activities here in Australia, one of the last things that they did, for this I'm eternally grateful indeed to J&J generally, I am, was that they gave back the technology to the University of Sydney. Originally, we were interacting with a fine person, Dennis Wade, and then more recently, Susan Pond. Sue has also been associated with Nano, Sydney Nano. She's a remarkable person, both have been remarkable people. Anyhow, so she ensured that the technology would go back to the University of Sydney, and then she flicked off the lights at Johnson & Johnson Research and went on to do other things. That meant that by that stage, I already had a lot of experience in interacting with industry, but I'd also developed a lot of networks independently of J&J at that time. And one such network had been associated with the Technology Park, we now call Cicada the Technology Park, early stage innovation support. They're a remarkable bunch. I guess they're called Cicada because you've got insects that bury themselves in the ground and then emerge when they're ready to emerge, right? I'm hoping that's the reason for the origin of the name, other than just solely an Aussie theme. And so they, again, were just a bunch of buddies who said at the time, Tony, we would prefer to invest in you as an individual. We know you. We know the science is probably fine as well, but we really believe in you as an individual. And so I think that's really one of the first lessons from today. You've got to have your networks in place, and that we can discuss later on if you wish, Jim. But fundamentally, those networks meant that they had an element of trust. Buddies recognize and I guess have confidence in each other. And through people like Mark Bradley and subsequently Hamish Hawthorne, amongst others, who are just remarkable in the early stages at the Technology Park, we got our first funding. And that really helped it to really fly. Between those two events, we tried a weird hybrid model that really never would have succeeded with the benefit of hindsight. And I would caution people against this one. We set the company up exactly as you said in 2005. The true structure at the technology park was 2008. So what happened in those intervening years? Well, the answer is that we tried to do it out of the lab in the University of Sydney for a while. So for a couple of years, the University of Sydney ran a virtual Elastagen. I thought up the name. I thought Elastagen's nice. It's got lots of vowels, so it sounds good, right? And we ran it out of the University of Sydney lab, and we would plan to make product in the lab, but we had no true understanding of expanding in the commercial space, and we had lots of naivety. And we also, as a virtual CEO, had a business development manager from what was the predecessor to CDIP. And you know, the technology transfer people, and he could only give part of his time to the process. So there we were trying to set up a company on the campus, and it was silly. It was never going to properly succeed. And then eventually, of course, that was when we transitioned across to the technology park.
Can I just, let me probe a little bit on that one. It sounds like the challenge was, and you can clarify this, it sounds like the challenge was that you were not that the university is a bad environment in any, you know, or the labs were in not sufficient, but rather that you're isolated and you were kind of scrambling and didn't really have much guidance as to what you should be doing. Whereas Cicada, you're in a hub where there's other people doing similar things. Is that was that a benefit?
It is very much so. And I think you summarized it beautifully. There's good intention at the university level. In fact, I would say to this day, you know, CDIP is under-resourced, but their intentions are good. So whenever you work with them, you know, you need to recognize you can't leave it all in their hands because they are under-resourced despite their best intentions. So, you know, you work side by side with them. And I think that's an important additional message, you know, where you share a common goal in making things succeed. Yeah, CDIP's real expertise is setting up the structure to connect with those in the outside world. And inevitably, you've got to go to the outside world, right, to make this all work well. And that's exactly what we did. And so in that case, the outside world was moving Elastagen from within the walls of the university to outside the walls into the technology park over in Redfern. And that was a big step. It was like watching your kid take baby steps and walk out the door, so to speak. You know?
Well, there's a few things on my mind here, but one thing that blows me away is your academic career.
Thank you.
And success and your success in commercialization. If you dial the clock back earlier on, did you have a bent towards commercialization, or how did this come about? And you know, and then equally, how do you balance it?
Yeah, I know, right. Well, that is one of the toughest things in our game, isn't it? We have to make sure that our academic career is nurtured and looked after as we move through. It's interesting, in the early days, I was advised by a former dean who should probably remain nameless, that I should not interact with industry. He used some fairly strong language. I think the word prostitution was in there somewhere as well. I was told that it would ruin my career prospects. And I couldn't quite work out whether it was advice or a threat, or maybe both. But anyhow, I walked out of the room and thought, well, you know, the dean's wrong. And I wouldn't advise people routinely to think the dean's always wrong, but certainly in that case, I think that particular dean was. So I did face a personal journey of having to really believe that what I was doing was right, and recognize that there was a risk that it could damage the career, but I never truly believed it would happen. And exactly as you said, Jim, thankfully, I've been very nicely rewarded by a wide range of metrics. Most recently, the NHMRC giving their senior level 3 award through the investigator scheme. You know, it's a 5-year leadership grant, and also just last year, the Clooney's Ross Award from the Australian Academy of Technology, Science and Engineering, which is their top award too. So the way, perhaps I'll divide the answer into two parts. One is first just a couple of general comments, and the second one is to try and guide everyone listening as to how you can try and do things. I'll give you a couple of clues and hopefully some good guidance here too. So in terms of things, the way I tried to do this was to really develop the tech without ever damaging the lab's fundamental process. I still kept on going for the grants. I still kept on trying to succeed with that, but also recognized that what I had to give was probably sleep and weekends to some extent. You know, this doesn't come from nowhere. You've got to have an absolute passion and a strong drive to make it work. You've got to have the consistency of excellent science. If it's anything less than excellent science, then obviously it won't commercialize well. You just got to look at the COVID environment now. Anything less than outstanding science in a vaccine will not succeed. Anything less than an outstanding drug will not succeed, and so forth. So, you know, it's the same deal with anything that all of us do, isn't it? In terms of the pointers, there are a couple of key things. I think we have to make a little summary list of the key things you need to be in for. The first of these is, I think, that you should always make sure that whatever you do in terms of the commercialization science can be done at about the same time as you're doing your research. How's that done? In my case, for example, whenever we wanted to file for new patents, and patents are really the currency of any startup company. And as you've seen, I've in fact continued to get patents. We now have over 110 awarded patents against my name in over 20 patent families, which is just great to see now too, and it continues to rise. So I always would file for a patent through CDIP in the first instance, and that gave protection, after which then I was able to submit the paper for publication or speak about it publicly. So, you know, you've got this phase where you can't discuss things, it's all confidential. You file for the patent, so you work with that. We also had our favorite patent attorney as well. At the time, it was an outstanding collection of colleagues, and we really narrowed down to Tom Gumley to give Tom a bit of a boost. At Freehills now, that was an extraordinary experience and journey. He became very familiar with our tech. So always file for the patent first, start the process off, and then of course you can go out there and start to publish. Second thing, which I think is an important rule on this, is that you need to work with like-minded people when you're really beginning to develop your technology, people who know that great science is really driving everything. And I'll keep on pushing that theme throughout today. Great science drives a great company. And if you're doing that, they know that publications help to verify that it's great science. You know, peer review is an important way to judge. So inevitably getting those papers out is important too. And then the rest just flows on. You know, you can keep your academic career going and you can still apply for grants while at the same time getting these other things happening towards the commercialization side. It's a bit of a wordy answer, but I hope that conveys the message a bit.
Yeah, it does. I think the thing you said at the very beginning of, you know, the reality is it's hard work as well, right? I mean,
yeah.
I've just been jotting down, and often when you have these kind of discussions, you start to see some patterns in terms of almost like a checklist. And and so if we just look at, just to sort of put a stake in the sand in this chat right now, we've got expertise in a particular science, your area, you're an expert. We've identified a need, and there's a passion to sort of help solve the problem that's out in the real world. You mentioned the importance of relationships to help sort of get this thing started with J&J, and then the importance as well of that co-working environment like we have. I mean, we've got now the Sydney Knowledge Hub, which is kind of exactly that kind of environment where you can feed off one another. So let me just ask another part of the puzzle, a bit more on the funding side. venture capitalists, I mean, the assumption always is that venture capitalists are a big player right away. It's not always the case, but where did they come into play in your work, and how was that experience for you?
Yeah, thanks. And eventually, I'd like to get on to the remarkable people who ran Elastagen too, because I think really they should be given a big fanfare. So, in terms of the venture capitalists, yeah, we often have an image, don't we, of venture capitalists. I actually had a very good journey with them. It all comes back again to the idea that, you know, if you're an expert in your field, and particularly if you own that field, you've got a passion, and we all have a passion for our areas, don't we? So the key thing is own it and share that passion. You know, the venture capitalists pick up on that. They, it's funny, you know, while there's number crunching and there's a recognition of the science and so forth, at the end of the day, this is all a very human activity. You know, we still judge on the basis of the person. And that's been my experience with the VCs as well. When we started to interact with the technology park, and, you know, going back to 2008, so we're talking about a decade-long journey from that point onwards, to start the clock 2008 effectively outside the university. It's a decade long because it was biotech. These things can be shorter in terms of non-biotech areas. The people I've mentioned who are at the technology park were able to bring in a level of funding through their investment arm initially. It was a type of pre-seed, type of venture capital arm, and that was very sensibly run, but only small amounts of money. At that time, instead of the millions that you expect to see from VC, we only got about $250,000 in. But immediately, and this is another lesson, immediately we're able to leverage it with state government money. You know, state government and federal provides leverage tools. You know, we're all aware of things like ARC linkage and so forth, but there are other tools out there that kind of double the money and so forth. So we actually went from $250,000 to a little bit more than $500,000 right up front. And then with that $500,000, we weren't yet able to attract the true rest of the VCs in. And in fact, the initial investors didn't even know what the value of the company would be. So they couldn't even talk about, well, this is the shareholding, this is how much it's worth, and so forth, the classical investments. So they constructed what they call a convertible note, which basically is a mechanism that says, hey, we don't know what your value is. We'll either get a percentage back when something comes out at the end of this, which will give us a boost, a bit like putting money into an interest-bearing deposit, so to speak, or we'll convert our investment into a shareholding later on when true venture capitalists come along. And then they were incentivized to speak to their buddies, the VCs, and it was really through the technology park. And again, I can't praise them enough either. They used their networks in turn. And they brought in two of the leading VCs in Australia, Brandon Capital and GBS, two remarkable bunches of people, Sydney, Melbourne side of things. And they invested the true money into us. And we got then of the order of $4 million that came in. And that was when we finally were able to not only construct a board, but we had an amazing group of people led by an amazing CEO.
Okay, wow. Interesting pathway. Let me go back now and ask about the people, because that is, in this sort of diagram I'm drawing on a piece of paper here, it is probably, arguably, the key thing that transcends all of this and meshes it together. Tell me about early stage people. Was it hard to get the right talent as you grew? Anything that you relate in terms of building the company?
Sure, happy to do that. So yeah, it was. So the story is that that we needed great people. I mean, we all know in the university system that we need to have great postdocs, we need to have great PhD students, we need to have great collaborating colleagues and so forth. It is no different at all in the commercial world. And in fact, the other thing you need to do is let go a little bit of your ownership on this, which is, in my mind, was the hardest thing to do. I talked about the sense of the little baby walking out the door, so to speak, and then next thing you know, in 2008, it's walking and talking, right? Maybe running. So there is a sense of those next steps. How do you let go a little bit and let the experts look after what they do well? And that is, of course, you've got to have amazing people. First up, I've got to mention the CEO. So Rob Daniels, who came in as the CEO, wow, Rob has been incredible. Rob initially came into the Elastagen story representing a venture capital fund. And he was introduced to the Elastagen story as a possible investor. And personal circumstances prevailed. Part of that is that, Rob is, although he's originally a Yorkshire lad, he had spent a bit of time in Australia. In fact, he married an Aussie, and eventually made his way back into Australia, even though at the time he was operating partly out of Asia. And so he was happy to take on the role as CEO, especially after Hamish Hawthorne had a bit of a chat with him from the technology park. So again, it's always networks again. And so there's Rob taking over as CEO with a tremendous record sitting on both sides of the table, as both, investor experience, but also knowledge of what it means to be a CEO. Very rare experience for Australia. We still don't have a lot of that expertise over here. That's changing. That, management expertise that's outstanding is still a bit thin on the ground here. And then inevitably the VCs who came in and said, wow, we've got great science, looks like we're happy with the scientist, and great CEO, etc., and great structure for the company, they then invested and they made sure that the company was structured appropriately. And that's when it became a true company. And that's GBS and Brandon, as I described, that really came in. And by that stage, now we had millions, bring the order of 5 million total then into the company to help run it. And that allowed us to really drive through what's called Series A funding round, and to truly have a company that kept its costs low by sitting at the technology park. They do keep a lot of your costs low, and that's another lesson out of today. If you can, I would recommend considering the technology park to run your company. Keeps rents low. They provide a lot of office functions and so forth for you. They provide the networks. They even provide half-decent coffee downstairs as well. So it's all worthwhile. And on that basis, then we had enough money to see us through for a few more years.
Okay. I mean, talent is a big topic. It of course depends on what field you're in. In the area that I work in, quantum technology, it's emerging. Certain areas don't have a local. Many areas don't have a strong local supply of talent. If we think of projecting growth in that industry, and I'm sure others can say the same thing. So, I mean, as you started to populate this sort of middle and lower level roles in the company, was there ever a pressure that you just couldn't do it here, and that Australia was not the right place to do this, and you had to go overseas?
Oh yeah, 100%. There was a real risk. I personally have strongly believed that we should try and do it here, and another reason for that is that if we're successful in doing so, we get an outcome of the type that you described earlier on. We see hundreds of millions that can potentially then flow back into the country, and that's a big deal. I mean, I think that helps out Australia. There is the issue of acting locally and thinking globally, and sometimes vice versa. But the reality is, I think we can and should try and do it here. Clearly, if you can't, for a range of very logical reasons, then you're silly to think of anything other than global. But my recommendation is try to do it locally. We did it. I reckon you can do it too. And I'm aware of plenty of stories of where you can. There's nothing to stop you from interacting with people internationally. We did a lot of early stage international collaborations. We, as a company, set manufacturing locally. And then when we ran out of the size of equipment that could do things locally, we then worked globally. But we still were officially the manufacturers here in Australia, and took the responsibility and had the ownership, and the dollar flow went back to here as well. So I think many of that's useful. And if I could also add to this, I could say that in 2016, we got Series B funding, which brought in an extra $14 million. Most of that funding came in through a range of not only a repeat investment by Brandon and GBS, but we're also able to bring in funding from Japan and two from Korea, and a venture capitalist, and also Wellcome Trust. The Wellcome Trust was tremendous. They had funded work out of my lab, and they were so excited that eventually they took ownership in Elastagen. So they took a shareholding too. And that's out of the UK, right? So, and in fact, I think Julia Gillard is now the person running the Wellcome Trust, who wasn't doing it at the time, but it's just, there is an Aussie connection there after all. So it's amazing to see how things all connect up, and how wonderfully you can actually really make things rise. So it gave us the chance to just keep on building. And then we kept on building leverage funding out of state and federal money as well. We didn't stop there. So we got more and more funding in. So I guess I'm trying to get at is, really, Jim, that we did think about international, but you can see that we're able to bring the money in locally, and we're able to make a big game and operate globally while still living out the technology park. It still worked well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, a couple of thoughts. One is just to emphasize again how important it is to initiate relationships and then nurture, foster those relationships over time. You might not even know why, but I've found that they often come back. The other thing, though, is also that in a startup world, you're faced with big decisions, and it might be, do we go overseas or stay here? And you have to make that decision commercially minded, and sometimes it will work out and sometimes not, and that's just the reality of it. So let me just say to the audience, please type in a question for Tony. You may have something that you're working on in the lab that you think has some interest, and maybe have some questions about how to interact with CDIP or the Commercialization Tech Transfer Office, or maybe you're wondering, how do I get in front of somebody like a J&J, somebody out there in the world to validate and test my ideas on. So please just feel free to jot something in, and we'll get the question to Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And let me also, by the way, put a plug in while we're discussing this for some of the funds that might be of interest to people, particularly in New South Wales, but there are equivalents or variations on this theme elsewhere across the country. One of these is the Medical Devices Fund, which is run out of the New South Wales State Government. In our case, we were able to get in $2 million of non-dilutory funds, but non-dilutory means it doesn't really affect the shareholding structure, so it keeps the venture capitalists happy. So it gave us a bonus $2 million to spend on useful purposes. And they said, look, if you don't succeed, don't pay it back. But if you do succeed one day, give us the $2 million back. So it's actually a 0% loan, basically, with not too many strings attached. And so we got the $2 million in the first round, and that was for our product development. And a couple of years later, we got a bit cheeky. And again, I've got to thank Rob Daniels for this. Again, it's another wonderful example of an amazing CEO. 2016 said, well, we'd like to now go for $4 million. And they said, well, really, you've already had your go at this fund. And we said, well, is there any restriction? And they said, no, not really. So we went for the fund again, and we got $4 million, which gave us a total 6 million out of state government money. So we were the most funded out of anything thus far in the medical devices fund. And we're also the first to pay back the money that we'd received from state government. There's an equivalent fund in the physical devices area, the Physical Devices Fund, and that's at New South Wales level. That's run out of the office of the New South Wales Chief Scientist.
Yeah.
Exactly, and I'm well aware of that because of the fact that I now sit on the panel that assesses the physical devices
That's
applications.
good to know. That's really good to know, Tony. Thank you for
Pleasure.
Telling. Yeah, I mean, and that's a fairly new one, isn't it?
It is. Yes, it is. And you know, if people want to get some ideas or pointers about the right way to write up a grant application or something similar, it has to be something where you really are advanced. You know, you've really got a product, a widget that, you know, it's ready to go out there and impress the world. But yeah, I'm very happy to provide guidance to people then too.
I think Omid's said there's a question. Omid, do you want to?
Yeah, there is a question actually regarding the current environment. Basically, I think this is mainly relevant to even pre-COVID, not necessarily the COVID. It asks, do you think it would be possible to commercialize elastogen in today's environment, given that, for example, JJ has withdrawn from Australia and similar things that we happened in Australia in the past. I think this is mainly pre-COVID, but I think COVID has changed a lot of things as well.
Yep. Thank you. Very happy to comment. So first up, let me again emphasize that J&J shut down its activities separate to us starting up Elastagen. So the two separate activities there. But yeah, in terms of the process, let me just put some perspective on this. First up, you know, is the funding available? And, you know, we all know about the difficulties with grants right now. And I think that's why I was fortunate enough to get the NHMRC, you know, fellowship. I'm thrilled about that one. And that covers security for 5 years for the lab, which again, you know, must say something. But the bottom line is that there is extraordinary funding out there. You know, did you know, for example, that a worldwide venture capital fund called Blackstone just closed a massive fundraising round for its latest life sciences fund to the tune of several $1 billion. So, you know, there is a lot of money in that space, and that's available now for investment purposes. So who puts the money in? Well, it's people like the equivalent to our superannuation funds, but in the US, of course, you know, they call them pension funds. There is a range of different groups ready to see they're going in. So first up, there is money around. People want to invest. And whether there are superannuation funds, whether it's personal investors, whatever, they will put their money quite often with VC funds and they're ready to invest. In some cases, VC funds will be more cautious, but they know that the great research and science is still out there. Are there great people to lead and run these companies? The answer is yes. So I'm not saying it's ever easy. I'm not saying that it's you know, any time is more or less. I know that now is a particularly unstable time in many ways, but the reality is when there's great stuff happening, people are still doing things, and you and I know, all of us, I'm just really pointing my hand to each person listening today, we all know of tech stories that are still coming out on a daily basis. An enthusiasm, oddly enough, for science and the power of research and the importance of great science driving decision processes. So me, I'm eternally the optimist, but I would say go for it. And if you've got great stuff that's worthwhile trying to pursue, do it. Don't look at the headwinds too much. Just fill the sail with wind and head them off towards the new lands. That's my call. I go for it.
There is another question.
Yeah.
I think there is a follow-up question regarding your journey. Is that based on what you have learned, what is your what do you have basically to let us know in terms of where do you think Australia in general should should move ahead to have more of these examples. You know, more startups, more entrepreneurship, more people with passion of, you know, commercialization. Where do you think this should go forward?
Yeah, thank you. So I think one of these is doing what we're doing today. I think that you know, I'm not the only success story, but I'm one of, unfortunately, a relatively small number for Australia. I think we're going to get the message out. I believe very strongly and really, you know, deep inside, that by sharing the story and showing that it can be done, that we should share the fact that it's not impossible, quite the opposite. It can be done, particularly if you've got a fire in the belly, you can do that. I think in addition to that, an important thing is that, gee, we really do need more funding for fundamental research, don't we? You know, I don't still understand why our ARC funding is low and the NHMRC funding is low, etc. It's nuts. We do need more of that, because there's great science that we're all doing, but you need to be able to build up that science to a stage where you, as researchers, know that, okay, now it's able to be taken out there to commercialize. I now have that idea. I've got that great gadget. I've got something that has, and we emphasize this, intellectual property protection, working with CDIP to make sure that I've got patents around this, because in the beginning, the patents are your currency to be able to go to the VCs and say, we've got total monopoly control over this with the patents. No one else can copy us because we have legal control in the space. So acquiring these patents, acquiring this kind of robust intellectual environment's great, but you need to have, of course, the grants, and the grants at the stage are still the painful exercise. I wish that'd be easier. One other thing, though, is that you also have to have the thrill of the ride. You know, part of this experience is that being involved in a company is like sitting on a roller coaster. You know, it's not just simply have you got the funding in, so now we can do research. It's actually you're taking research out of the lab. You're trying to make those gadgets or things and put them on shelves. You're trying to make something that succeeds. You know, when you start the roller coaster ride, you know you're going to get to the other end at some point. But you know, you go down the ride, you go up the ride. It's Monday's great, Tuesday's terrible, Wednesday looks like it's all going to collapse, Thursday's awesome, Friday's back to being normal again, and then you start the week. It's a very interesting journey, and you have to love the roller coaster ride in order to do that. What drove me is a sense of absolute belief that what we have is worthwhile and will help people and it will succeed. So you've got to stick with that. And the last thing is that that I think that you know, if you've got the mindset, if you've got the tummy for it, and if you've got the people around you, get more people around you, and it can still succeed. There are enough people out there in the current environment who still want to make these things work. You know, like-minded people who can make it happen in the current environment. No different to how it was back when I formed Elastagen in the early days. It's still the same process, and exactly as discussed, it's about the people, it's about the robustness of your science, and that rule is no different today to how it was then. I reckon we could have started Elastagen up now and gone down a very similar journey. And again, I would really encourage you to go for it.
Great, thank you.
Tony, I mean, there's a strong vibe, clear vibe of optimism in everything that you're saying, and I think, you know, that's a personality trait to some extent. And you can try to choose to be optimistic, but it's in this kind of the number of challenges that you're going to be faced with. You have to have optimism, otherwise, you know, like you'll look at those headwinds too much and say, no, too hard, or that's a problem, and you know, therefore I'm gonna. So it's almost like table stakes in this in this game of you just have to have it, and you have to have this almost irrational belief that you're going to succeed, or what some people might think is irrational. Does that resonate?
Yeah, it does, actually. I think it's a nice summary. But let me also suggest that actually, as researchers, we probably already have that. I mean, don't we already believe in what we're doing? When we write those grant applications, we truly believe that, you know, that we're writing something worthwhile. When we speak to that student coming in about joining the lab and trying to convince them that it is a worthwhile environment, we've got that optimism about us. And I think in a way we've been kind of previously selected. Now, we all know, of course, the colleagues on campus who aren't quite made of the same ilk, not quite cut of the same cloth. But on the whole, I think, you know, we're made of robust stuff. And I think part of this is just recognizing something within us that's already there. We have been selected. We actually have, going through the academic system, somehow been the cream that's risen to the top of the milk, you know. Yeah, it's probably already in there in most people listening to this conversation today. You may not necessarily know it yet, you know.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions coming through, but I'm enticed to also just ask this one along the same line: is what was luck? Did luck play a role? Do you have recollections of things of like, oh, that was lucky?
Yeah, a lot. You know, very human processes I've been trying to really push at in our chat today, which I appreciate. Luck, for example, was, let's say, we discussed J&J today. Remarkable people running Johnson & Johnson research here in Australia. You know, bottom of my heart appreciation to Dennis Wade and Susan Pond. But also the other colleagues at J&J, and the list is too long to name them all. But let's imagine, for example, the J&J, which had negotiated with the University of Sydney at the time to have complete ownership of the IP, and they could commercialise the way they saw it as a classical outsourcing. When was this restructuring, and they shut down the local Australian operations, without Susan's efforts, you know, the university would not have received unencumbered the technology back to do things with it as we saw fit. You know, she believes strongly in the benefits in taking it out of the drawer and handing it back. Would be much easier for her before switching off the lights, just to sort of close that drawer and flick the lights off and then leave. So that's luck, you know, to have someone like her there and to have J&J's efforts to move things over. Technology Park, people like particularly Hamish Hawthorne, mentioned Mark Bradley earlier on, particularly Hamish. I mean, you know, non-stop enthusiastic guy who went with every twist and turn. There are lots of twists and turns. I guess that's the analogy with the roller coaster ride. There was Hamish ready to catch someone at the risk of falling off, you know. And he happened to weirdly be standing at the right spot to catch each time around, you know. Had he stood somewhere else, it wouldn't have happened. The list goes on, but I think particularly, I would say there was luck getting in the right people. You know, if Rob Daniels hadn't been the right CEO, we had someone who was maybe a bit more selfish or didn't keep his eye on the ball or whatever, wouldn't have succeeded. And the list goes on. So luck, yeah, at regular turns. It's a combination of luck and great science, great business and so forth. At any stage, it could have fallen over. It's a very human process, isn't it?
Omid, go ahead.
Yeah. Just that's fascinating. Now, I want to combine a few questions that are asked, and also my question are blended into it. So basically, the questions are about the lessons and the lessons that we can learn from the experience of you dealing with JJ and at the same J&J, and at the same time, another question is about the seed funding and how we approach that first step. And I know a lot into it beyond the great science. So, for example, my personal question to you is, and I know it might be different from, is there any role for a failure there? Like a past failure that you had, maybe you went through it and you didn't succeed, and then you learned the lesson from that and you tried again. And also, at what point you approach, let's say, CDIP for a provisional patent, because that's a little bit of credibility into it as well, right?
Yeah.
And I think that plays an important role. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I would say that I regularly fell over and picked myself up. I definitely got scraped knees out of the experience. Um, a couple of times when things fell over, the J&J prehistory we discussed. The problem in interacting with a large company was that a large company is diffuse. You know, we're used to a university being a big, lumbering exercise and operation. It's got a lot of people. It's a complicated entity. And if it were a ship, it would need a very big rudder to move it. So it's the same too with big companies. You know, they have levels of caution within them and so forth. So, you know, with J&J, I thought, wow, you know, this is a done deal now. We're all signed up. We're ready to go. You know, tomorrow they're going to commercialize it, but actually they didn't quite know how to commercialize it. J&J was used to buying packages, buying pre-made companies, so to speak. And you often hear nowadays of companies being purchased, just like the Elastagen story was. And it took me a while to learn that that was actually a much better present to wrap up than to say, here's Tony sitting in a lab or standing occasionally in front of you. Take my science, isn't it great? They didn't quite know how to do it. They wanted to, but they just didn't know how to handle it. And I was so naive, I didn't know how to transition things either. So that was a fall over when, you know, repeatedly, when we just didn't know how to transition it. Everyone wanted to make it happen, but it just, the ability to take it into a true product that would be giving us royalty feed, royalty flow, just didn't quite succeed there. In terms of establishing an Elastagen, eventually I realized you had to have a company establish this package I talked about. We established it in 2005, but you recall that only in 2008, we take it outside the University of Sydney. Well, what happened in the interim, that was also fall over and a mistake, I think. Again, not with bad intention, best of intention, but just didn't work. Setting up a company within the walls of the University of Sydney, this wasn't really a formula, because universities are great for doing research, but they're not really great for, you know, running a company. You know, you just don't do that. So we had to take it outside. That was a fall over event there too. So those and others were regular processes where I fell over and picked up and learnt each time. So yeah, there are lots of stories and lots of experiences, I think, that from those that I can probably guide people on the basis of what you should and shouldn't do, at least in terms of my type of journey. In terms of getting the funding in, and that was interesting too. But in terms of the patent side of things, the patent story is fascinating. We began to file for patents very early on, and that's again where I would recommend work with CDIP. As I said, you can't rely on them alone because they're under-resourced, but they will work with you. And then we began to file for those. And did you know that the first patent we filed for, the first provisional patent we filed for initially, was used as the basis for that first conversation with J&J. And J&J said we'd like to negotiate an arrangement with the University of Sydney. We'd like to have an agreement in place, and we'd like to make sure that we can fund work out of Tony's lab. It took them 1.5 years from that decision to finally having an agreed agreement and a contract in place. But J&J, to their credit, under the tutelage of Dennis Wade in those days, helped to still, with a handshake, fund activities in my lab at the University of Sydney until we finalised the agreement. It was extraordinary, and I think it's quite rare. They literally funded us, knowing we could walk at any stage, but they trusted on a person-to-person basis. It comes back to a trust in the person and the people to make sure things get done. And then eventually, when we did get the contract done, we then picked up on the basis of that previous funding, and we filed for more patents that then ran through further still. Finally, to fast forward it, J&J got funded, sorry, no, J&J left, and then we got funded for Elastagen 2008 fully, as we discussed, leading through eventually through various funding rounds. They gave us well over $20 million eventually. I turned to my wife, Jackie, in 2012, said, oh, you know, this is it, we're going to succeed this year. And then every year after that, until eventually the company hit that amazing milestone that Jim described in 2018 value, we, every year, Jackie kept on asking me, so is it 2012 yet? So we just kept on going through that roller coaster ride. So it was a roller coaster ride that ran for many years. You know, at the end, it was 2012, but it happened to be in 2018. So yeah, I hope that answers the question and adds a bit of color to it too.
Tony, I have to. I'm watching the clock, and I'm going to jump in now. There's my apologies to the few questions that just didn't get an opportunity to be asked, and but as Tony said, he is around, so it's possible that it can be answered. I'm glad you mentioned the exit, because I was thinking, you know, we've talked this entire time and not even spoken about that sort of crescendo, and perhaps it's a nice reflection of where the real work happens, is not, you know, when you finally make the exit, but everything that leads up to it, which is such an amazing result. So
thank you,
Tony. I just want to express my gratitude personally and just from the community for your time. I'm glad we recorded this. It's some fantastic content and advice. So thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you.
Absolutely.
For joining.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jim. Thank you all to all your team and to all our listeners today. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks. Okay, we'll end the call now, and take care, everybody.